Thank you so much for dedicating your lunch hour to this, hopefully madness that will keep you awake. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about some ideas that my co-author, co-conspirator, Huggy Rao, he's at the business school, I'm in the engineering school, have been working on for about 4 or 5 years. To be perfectly honest, these ideas are pretty half-baked, so don't take them too seriously. And also the other thing I would like to do, although the camera creates some challenges, we can get around it, is to have some discussion. So let's kind of, and there's a PowerPoint deck here, and honestly, I've been teaching long enough, it doesn't matter if I get through the PowerPoint deck. This is not a mystery novel where you discover what happens in the last 3 minutes. It's one of those things where it's an ongoing set of ideas, and I always pretend that I'm done, and because that project isn't finished anyways. So let's make the ground rules. It's your job to talk, and it's my job to stop you. And in about 10 or 12 minutes, since I've never given this talk exactly, I don't know exactly when this happens, I'm going to ask this fine gentleman to turn off the camera, and we're going to have a little bit of interaction with the camera off for psychological safety because of our employer. And for me too, not just you. And then we'll turn it back on when I go back to my more or less prepared remarks, okay? All right, so can I stand this far up? Am I okay?
Yes.
Okay, because I've spent much of my life being filmed by cameras and resenting it, so this poor guy's got to deal with me. Okay, so let me describe how this project sort of started. In 2014, Huggy and I wrote a book called Scaling Up Excellence, which was about how to spread goodness in organizations and maintain supposedly the excellence of organizations as they get larger. And in the process, in the last 5 years of working with companies and lots of nonprofits, lots of universities, as they got larger and more complex, we discovered that, and this is not really a shock, that as organizations got larger, more complex, and older, that things got harder and harder to do. And we also discovered that, and I guess we knew that when organizations made it too hard to do things early on, they usually didn't make it. So we got interested in this idea of organizational friction. Then at the same time, and I will say this with the camera on, this is my 37th year teaching at Stanford. And every year that I've been here, it's been a little harder to get things done. And I won't say who it is, but a friend of mine who has been involved in raising a lot of money for Stanford, she was describing to me recently, she said, so in the early days, I would do 95% of my time fundraising and 5% compliance. Now it's 50-50. So I believe in compliance. I believe that we should have bureaucracy. I believe we should not have to break rules, but this question of organizational friction is something that Huggy and I are quite interested in. Okay, so that's kind of the setup. And so I'm a psychologist. So when people get in situations where it's harder to do things, difficult to do things that they believe are valuable and important and necessary to their well-being and so on, this is sort of a hierarchy. I'm not quite ready to say this is like Maslow's hierarchy, which, by the way, if you've heard of it, doesn't really exist. We can talk about that later. So first you get frustrated, but you keep trying, and then you start realizing, oh, I feel helpless, and then you just give up. So that's sort of the process, the psychological process that underlines what we're thinking about. Oh, what's this? I don't know why it's doing that. And then when we start talking to groups like you, here's some of the phrases we hear. And the language is really interesting. I won't read them all. Email jail, death by meeting, sludge. Oh, chocolate Easter bunnies is interesting. My friend Becky Margiotta, so Becky led this amazing campaign that found, the 100,000 Homes campaign that found homes for 100,000 homeless Americans. It's kind of amazing campaign. And so she realized about halfway through the process, one of the things that added a lot of friction to the process was what she were chocolate Easter bunnies. These are people who go to meetings and like pretend like they were actually doing something, but they just talk and talk and talk and wouldn't actually do anything. Efficiency tools that wreck efficiencies, more pilots, kind of pilot studies in American Airlines. So this is some of the kind of language we would hear, and we hear, and hopefully we'll hear some more later. And then people write us their tales of woe. So here's an EVP at a Fortune 50 company, so somebody who should be powerful, describing the process of getting his budget approved. So I wait for approval for one person so I can get in the queue to wait for approval from the next and the next and the next. And I get sent back to people who approved by request already because they didn't do it right. Now, it just sounds to me like when I submit my expense report to Stanford, to be honest. And this is my friend Katie DeSalle, who actually visited us last year, and I love this description because this is a company unwittingly making it impossible to buy anything. So look at this. I went into the salon to buy some hard-to-find sunscreen. The woman at the counter asked me if I had an appointment. I just said no, I just want to buy the sunscreen. Then she asked if I had an account. I said no. Then she asked, what is your phone number? She said, I don't give it out. We know why you don't give out phone numbers. You get spam forever. Then she conferred with, her husband works for Google. She really knows why not to give out a phone number. Then she conferred with a coworker who told me I must start an account to buy it. I walked out. So this is the defeat at the end I was talking about. Then, if you start digging, so this is like stories. If you start digging into kind of academic research and other studies, there's a bunch of evidence that suggests, and I think this is where I would put Stanford, that if you will, the road to hell is paved by good intentions. Like nobody at Stanford or any other organization means to make things impossible to do, but they do something they think is good, and then it just makes things worse and worse. So I'll give you some examples. So the collaboration, we all hear how great collaboration is. There's this thing called collaborative overload we'll talk about later. There's a bunch of research that shows that in this effort to have collaboration and to share in everything, we spend so much time in meetings, doing emails, Slack, whatever you use, Zoom. I noticed that there's some people in this room who had a lot of Zoom meetings with, that we actually can't get the rest of our work done. So does anybody have the electronic medical records experience where you go to the doctor or the nurse and they never actually look you in the eye, they just type the whole time? So electronic medical records in theory are great because it's great to have our records maybe in one place, but there's some studies, so this is one, a time use study by 80 medical residents, and look at this. They spent 13% of their time, there's time and motion studies, they followed them around and recorded everything they did. 13% direct patient care, 21% in rounds, and look at the rest. The rest is, they're not dealing with us, they're dealing with the bureaucracy. And again, this experience of when you're having electronic medical records, they don't even look you in the eye because they have to maintain them. Okay, one more bit of evidence. So there's a thing called 360-degree evaluations. Does Stanford have 360-degree evaluations? We do? Not anymore? There's some parts. So somebody in 3 sentences describe to me what a 360-degree evaluation is. Yeah, thank you.
What I'm familiar with is that it allows colleagues to weigh in on the job you're doing, as well as your manager.
So that's sort of two different perspectives. If you get a real full-blown 363, this is at Deloitte, you get the customers, you get everybody is involved in your full sort of evaluation. And Deloitte sort of, which is this huge sort of consulting firm, went into this process of doing 360-degree evaluations, and they actually have trimmed it back some. So you can see that they figured out that they spent 2 million hours a few years ago, I think it was 2015, doing 360-degree evaluations. And note, this is a company that the way they make money is by billing clients by the hour. So this is, and they have trimmed it back some. Okay, so, but this is all, 360-degree evaluations, everybody means that to be good, but it sort of goes out of control. Okay, so that's the Friction Project, and you can sort of see the emotional thing that kind of got us there and the academic literature that got us there. And essentially what Huggy and I are on this little mission, we're trying to understand what ought to be easier to do in organizations and what ought to be harder. If we have time at the end, I'll talk about the virtues of friction. It's not all bad to have things hard to do. There's some things, for example, bad behavior should be harder to do. I really believe that. And then we're talking about things that organizations can do to, if you will, to inject, to get rid of bad friction and to inject good friction. And that's sort of the project. We're doing a bunch of things. We're doing traditional academic research. So Huggy's actually got a really interesting paper that describes why 360-degree evaluations rose in American industry. That would be an example of research on that. Practical articles. So I guess I've written 3 articles for the Wall Street Journal. I don't like their editorial policies, by the way, but I do like dealing with their regular news editors. So practical articles. We have a bunch of material on the Stanford Technology Ventures website. We got some folks from STVP here. And on my own website, for a couple of years through Stanford Technology Ventures program, We did a friction podcast where we talked to various people about friction. If you're going to listen to them, you want to only listen to two. The two best ones are Patty McCord, who was head of HR of Netflix for the first 14 years, and Craig and Annie Stoll, who run the Pizza Delfina mini chain together. They're a husband and wife team. I think those are the best two, so if you just want to listen to two, I'd listen to those.
Can you repeat the second name, sir? The second name?
Oh, Craig and Annie Stoll. Delfina Pizza in downtown Palo Alto and Burlingame and stuff. They were really great because she was the one who obviously kept the thing running, and he got to be the creative type. So it was kind of interesting conversation. And we've done some nudges and pilots. We teach classes. So this is how we're learning. All right. So that's enough. What I want to do, and could you please turn off the camera for now?
Why, yes.
Thank you very much. Okay, so what I want to do next is to talk about some of the perspectives that are emerging from our sort of ongoing research. One is, in the Financial Times, we just had an article talking about this today, talking about our work. So this is Jeremy Utley. Has anybody ever met, if you've ever been to the D School, you might have met Jeremy Utley. He's one of the most charismatic people at the D School. He's really exciting, and I've taught with him for years. He got an MBA, but he couldn't stand to leave Stanford. Anyhow, so Jeremy Utley, one day we're sitting around getting ready for a Stanford D School class, and Jeremy stands up and screams, "I hate wasting people's time." And he's really, and as a teaching sort of approach, and one thing that Huggy and I started realizing when we heard Jeremy talk and looking at leaders who are better rather than worse about friction is the best leaders see themselves as kind of trustees of their people's time. And I think that that's something that is kind of consistent with, if you're going to have an organization that deals with friction well, that's the kind of leader that you want. The second one, back to a basic process here, is, and you could hear it in your sort of comments and everything, that if you're trying to figure out both the causes and cures of dysfunctional friction, it isn't just an organizational design problem. Yes, it's an organizational design problem. You need to design the decision rights, design the handoffs, and so on. But there's also a bunch of emotional elements. There's emotional elements because you're designing the human experience, the frustration, trying to get that out of it. And then the other thing about it that also leads us to view it as sort of part organizational design and part therapy is that there are some elements in some organizations that are friction-filled that honestly we just can't get rid of. They're just part of being in a large, complex, quickly changing organization, which we seem to be in. And sometimes what your job as a leader or a colleague, or perhaps to help your boss, is to help one another get through it emotionally, because there's some things that we just can't fix. So leading people or leading one another through the friction process, it's partly organizational design, it's partly being aware of how people feel when they're dealing with 7 different sort of handoffs and bureaucracies, but some of the stuff, at least temporarily, is going to be shitty for a while, to use the word. And a lot of it is just helping one another through, because the world is never going to be perfect. So that's sort of our provisioning, kind of some mental provisioning. And so what I'm going to do for the rest of the time, and then if we have time, we'll do Q&A, but also ask questions, make comments if you have any, is the way that we're thinking about friction fighting is we're thinking about it for leaders of all kinds and other folks who are involved in a system that there's kind of different on-ramps, there's different intervention points that leaders can take to get rid of dysfunctional friction. So I'm going to talk about 5 of them, and then, as I said, if we have time, we'll talk about the virtues of friction. Okay, the first one is one that, this is my buddy Perry Claymont I teach at the D School with, who's head of executive ed there. It is this notion of what we call friction blindness. So one of the effects of being a senior executive, and the more senior you get, I think the worse that this gets, with all due respect to the executives who run Stanford, but it's true of every large organization, is that a lot of times executives don't have an understanding of the degree to which they accidentally and unwittingly make life harder for the people who lead them. So Perry calls this the cone of friction. These people who study collaborative overload, Rob Cross and his colleague Gray, they talk about the notion that senior leaders underestimate how overloaded people in their organizations are by as much as 50%. And just to give you an example of something one of our D-School classes did that showed this was about 8 or 10 years ago. One of the organizations we've worked a lot with is JetBlue, the airline, and one of the reasons is, just to give you my favorite Stanford probably graduate of all time, there's a woman named Bonnie Simi. Some of you may know her as Bonnie Warner. So Bonnie was a Stanford undergraduate, then she came back and got an MBA, and then she came back and got a degree in my department, Management Science and Engineering. So she's a 3-time Olympian in the luge. She is still an active commercial pilot. She heads JetBlue Ventures. She's just an amazingly positive, constructive person. So we're working with Bonnie, and Bonnie was interested in working with a D-School team to try to understand the customer experience of being a customer. And so what we had was 3 students, just, if you will, sort of track the experience of being a JetBlue customer. And what they found out was the worst part of being a JetBlue customer was at the luggage carousel. And I think we kind of all know this. It's like you're at the end of a flight, you're grouchy, you're tired, and then you're at the luggage carousel. And there's some good social psychology that would explain why this is a lousy experience. There's a guy named Daniel Kahneman who won the Nobel Prize in economics for kind of one of the 2 inventors of the modern field of behavioral economics. And he did some research that showed that the biggest impact of an experience, he called it the peak end rule, are the best and the worst parts and how it ends. So they had literally, the worst experience was at the end. So our students go back to New York, they present this to the JetBlue executives, and the JetBlue executives, friction blindness, remember, they have 2 reactions. One is they're kind of shocked and horrified, and second, they realize that the reason that they're blind to this experience is they never check luggage because they know how shitty it is. So I don't know what happened, but and JetBlue did work on doing some stuff, especially in their new air terminal at Kennedy, dealing with the experience. So that's one part, is this sort of friction blindness. And then, as one of my co-authors, Jeff Effer, likes to say, it's even worse than that. One of the things that executives do unwittingly, and if you know any senior executives, they always talk about resistance to change. They talk about, I've got this great idea I'm going to implement, but the people who work for me, they won't do it. Well, that happens sometimes, but sometimes there's a bunch of research to support this, that people watch their bosses so closely. There's all sorts of research that when you get human beings, and also apes, by the way, in hierarchies, there's asymmetry of attention, and we tend to watch those with more power and do things to flatter them. And so sometimes they unwittingly say and do things that cause workers to work like crazy and add a bunch of friction. So we call this executive magnification. And I'll give you a silly one and a big one. So about 8 or 10 years ago, I was doing a talk at let's just say a Fortune 50 company, because I'm going to get in trouble still if I say what it is. And what happened was they had a new CEO, and he just went to a breakfast meeting, and he just made an offhand comment. He said, "Where's the blueberry muffins?" That's just all he said. And then somebody wrote in the little, meeting prep for the CEO, there should be blueberry muffins. And he couldn't figure out for decades, for years, every place he went, there was piles of blueberry muffins. So that's sort of a silly one. But one that's serious, and this is so long ago, I had a full head of hair, in fact. So this is like probably 33 years ago. One of my colleagues at Stanford and I, we were doing research on courtesy in 7-Eleven stores. Now, if you've been to a 7-Eleven store recently, there isn't a lot of courtesy. But they actually, in the 80s, they got really obsessed with customer courtesy, and they spent so much money, millions, probably was like $15 million, $20 million, trying to improve customer service. And one of the main reasons, was the then CEO. He eventually ran it into the ground and into bankruptcy. But the then CEO, a guy named Jody Thompson, what he did was he went into a 7-Eleven store in Texas and encountered a really rude clerk. So he did what CEOs will do sometime. He came back to the office, had a temper tantrum, and people, whoa. So they spent $20 million on a courtesy campaign, and we were among the people who did research that showed that actually people don't care about courtesy to 7-Eleven store. They don't want a rude clerk, and they want to get in and out fast, and that's actually all they care about. And he found out about this quite late in the process. And just for example, one of the things they did is they had something called the Thanks a Million contest, where the owner or manager of a 7-Eleven store got $1 million for a drawing because they had perfect courtesy. I mean, they did all this stuff. And so he was kind of shocked to discover that this had all happened a few years later, nobody told him. So the point that I'm making here is there's cluelessness in magnification. Okay, that's the first. Any comments or questions on this? Because this is sort of going after leaders directly. They're not all clueless or magnifiers, but they do it unwittingly. Questions, comments? How does this play out here?
Manager, how can you make sure you're not doing it accidentally?
Well, the best you can hope for, and if you ask me the same thing over and over again, it's this thing called psychological safety. So that if people feel safe to say negative stuff to you and to give you feedback. That was the problem at 7-Eleven. They were all terrified of the Thompson brothers who owned it. And there's a woman named Amy Edmondson who's at Harvard Business School, and she's done all this research on preventing medical mistakes. And so this is much more serious than blueberry muffins or courtesy, that on surgical teams and other places where people feel safe to speak out when the surgeon has made a mistake or is about to, or the anesthesiologist. So, and this isn't about being nice, it's making it safe for people to bring up stuff. So that's, at least that's where the evidence would sort of point us at. The other thing you can do is to have, if you're talking about customer experience, is that if you have, and this is more for customers, is that if you go through the same exact customer experience that your customers or students or employees do, you will actually learn something. So one of my, and they're still doing this wrong, years ago, we in our department, Management Science and Engineering, we had a big contract with General Motors. By the way, this was in the 2 or 3 years leading up to their bankruptcy. So they were pretty screwed up. And one of the things they do at General Motors and they still do this, for managers, executives surprisingly low down, that if instead of going to a dealership and buying a car, what they do is they give you a new car every 3 months, and they repair it for you. And then even if you want to buy a car, or one of your relatives want to buy a car at a General Motors dealer, the price is pre-negotiated. So you don't have to go through the process. So that's a classic case where people in General Motors are sort of protected from the process of owning and buying a car. So that's another thing, is to just go through the experience. One thing that there's a D-School program where one thing that they do is they have principals and other administrators shadow students for the day just to see what their experience is like, to design schools for them. That would be another example. Okay, let's move on to the next one. All right, so the next one is silos and handoffs, and already in some of the examples that you talked about, these situations where something is handed from one system to the other, or one part of the university to the other, I think this is where all sorts of things happen. This is not a Stanford problem. Whenever you have silos and people in specialized roles, the handoffs are always a huge problem, and everything from fighting fires to, there's a whole bunch of research on nurse handoffs. So, when they switch, when they switch shifts in the new nursing, there's a whole bunch of research that talks about there should be a little conversation between the new nurses, the old nurses, and you about what's going on, and they do it in front of the patient when it's done properly. Maybe things are better at the Stanford Hospital, but I had the misfortune of spending 4 days at the Stanford Hospital this summer, and I did not see any of that going on. In the new surgical residence, we could talk about that forever. Anyway, but I guess they have to be trained somehow. Why on me? Okay, so an example of this, which was done by sort of an amazing pair in this D-School class called D-Leadership that I teach this. This is classic D-School where maybe the D-School has too much money, but it sure leads to some cool classes. So 24 students and 4 faculty members. So this is something that the university probably doesn't like from an efficiency standpoint, but it was Catherine Segovia, Perry Claybon, already talked about, and Jeremy Utley. And what we do in this class is we take pairs of Stanford students and we have them work with some organization to try to solve some creativity or human problem. And so this is one of the most amazing teams we ever had. So it's Elizabeth Woodson, who was actually Stanford Undergraduate University president. And consistent with the D-School, we let somebody in the class named Saul Gardis, who actually wasn't a Stanford student. He was an executive at an outside company. So they worked together. And what they did was they worked with a social services agency called the Golden Gate Regional Center. And what the Golden Gate Regional Center does is it provides services to disabled, children and adults and their families. And what Saul and Elizabeth figured out was many of the families failed to complete the application process for getting their family member services and themselves services because it often took more than 3 months. So they did some of these process maps things that, remember this doesn't work, and to sort of see what is your journey like for signing up your family. And I don't want to read all these, but there's guilty, confused. See if I can read these. I feel invaded. This is too hard. I don't want to do this. I'm still waiting. Frustration. And there would be all this frustration in the process of getting the family signed up. And once again, it's those situations where the people at the social service agency, they didn't want other people to suffer, but they were part of this sort of dysfunctional system. And so what Saul and Elizabeth did was sort of amazing. And this is a sign maybe we have too much money at the D-School sometimes, and maybe the Stanford will try to stop us from spending money on this. But what they did was they rented a Winnebago, and they pulled up to the social service agency. So that's Elizabeth. Sal took the picture. They loaded these are essentially, bureaucrats, people from different silos, like social workers, psychologists, and so on, other kinds of service providers. They put them in a Winnebago, and they went into a community, and they brought in clients and tried to sign them up all sitting in the same place. So they're from multiple silos. In 2 hours, for 9 clients, I think somewhere the initial thing was, we signed them all up in 2 hours. They didn't do that. It took 2 hours, and then there was another week of work to get them signed up. So essentially what they did was this sort of experiment to show that once you broke through the silos and dealt with the handoffs, it would happen really quickly. And if you sort of fast forward, and Saul Gardis is actually on the board of the Golden Gate Regional Center, and last time I talked, which was about a year ago, it's not like this cured the Golden Gate Regional Center. If you have to deal with them, it's not like you get signed up and it's all over in a few hours. But what's happened is the average time takes about 2 months, sometimes a little longer. But the main thing that's happened is the tail of the distribution is cut off, so the really horrible cases have been gotten rid of. And they have an ongoing team that helps with, if you will, creating some efficiency and cross-collaboration across the silos in understanding patient experience. But the reason this one is interesting is, again, this idea of the road to hell is paved by good intentions. Nobody at the Golden Gate Regional Center wanted this to be a bad experience, but there was something about the design of the system and maybe some complacency that made it work. So this is kind of a second cause and potential cure. Handoffs are the key. Comments or questions? I'm going to ask a question. Anybody found ways to overcome this kind of problem at Stanford? What do you do when something gets stalled? Ooh, thank you.
It's all about the personal relationships that you go and have to talk to people.
Yeah. So once you're dealing with a human being instead of being a faceless bureaucrat, yeah, I like that. Yeah, is that a hand? Anything else? I think that's pretty good. And also in the process, it isn't just when you get to know somebody who is this sort of faceless, nasty person who's holding things up, they understand your needs and you understand theirs. Okay, I like that. Anything else? Okay. So where am I? Okay, the next one. Okay, we already talked about this. So this is collaboration and cognitive overload. This came up in a bunch of your comments. So Rob Cross, Babson College, has been studying social networks forever. So he's done this stuff, and he shows how the time spent collaborated has been getting bloated. But the thing he focuses on are these people he calls beleaguered extra-milers. And I actually can name who some of those people are in my own department. I won't name them, but I know who they are. And these are essentially when he does social network analysis around collaboration, he'll find 3 to 5% of the people who basically do more than 30% of the useful collaboration. My test for this at Stanford is there are certain people who, whenever you have a problem, their name comes up. And I think we know who some of those people are. There's also some people, whenever you have a problem, their name comes up and you know not to go to them, too. Those are the other, and we'll talk about, we call those gunk people. We'll talk about those later. But that's the problem with collaboration overload. So in terms of dealing with collaboration overload, there's lots of ways to do it. The headline for a lot of what Huggy and I talk about is subtraction. So, and this is what happened with Golden Gate Regional Center too, is to find places in the process where you can actually remove stuff. This is not like a breakthrough idea, but it does work. And just to tell you my favorite subtraction story, and this came from Rebecca Hines, who's now a PhD student in our department. She went to work at Dropbox. And what happened, this is about 2013. This is Drew Houston. He's still the CEO of Dropbox. And so they discovered 3 things at Dropbox. 1, people were spending more time in meetings. 2, the size of the meetings were bigger. And 3, they were missing ship dates. So what they did, 2013, was they went in, and this was the email message that everybody got, our meeting-geddon has landed. What that meant was that the head of IT went in and subtracted all standing meetings from people's calendars, except with customers. So you literally look at, in my case, in your Outlet box, and all your standing meetings would be gone, and they couldn't re-enter them for 2 weeks. So this was like a sort of like a punctuated point, and then they came up with these new rules for meetings, and they posted them on the wall and everything. And the rules were, I'm not going to read all of them, but it's essentially, be mindful before you have a meeting, be careful about who you invite, keep it small, and if you get invited to a meeting and you can't be useful, don't show up. And my favorite one, so I'm 65, I'd probably be 63 if I'd left every meeting at Stanford where this was true. If you're at a meeting and it's not and your time isn't being used very well, you should walk out. So all this sounds great. It's kind of like fantasy material. Then when I talked to Drew, I saw Drew last summer, and this is somewhere in this deck, I said, Drew, how's it going? He said, it's even worse than usual. He said, it's like, than it was before, it's like mowing the lawn. You have to do it constantly, not all the time. Just in the name of app overload, this is sort of a new disease. And this was sort of mentioned in some of the examples you talked about, all the different systems. And the reason I like this one, so my daughter, who works for, so far, a reasonably successful startup, and she worked in customer service and is transitioning to sales, this is actually all the apps that she uses. Just the 11, I think it's 11 apps she switches back and forth between, and then there's another 2 that are homegrown. And this idea of sort of app overload, and that's the same thing at Stanford when we have to switch through different systems. So that's sort of, I guess, a third one, collaborative overload. And we did that. Any comments on collaborative overload? What can we, before I get to this one, what can we do to like reduce it for one another? Any ideas or anything you do to just reduce the load on others? Basic stuff? Thank you.
I don't have a suggestion, I have a question.
Oh, I like suggestions. I want to learn from you, yes.
I am curious about, my colleague Tom had brought up earlier, this sense that of fairness and everybody having a say in a decision, and is the workplace changing because of generational differences on it?
So I have a really strong point of view, and I think it is evidence-based, that every generation, every new generation of old people thinks that the new generation of young people are brand new and they need different things. And the evidence is actually pretty clear. If you get away, because it sells a lot of books to say that millennials, and what's the new generation? Gen Z, that they're completely different, and there might be some differences, but on the whole, if you look at that stuff on generational stuff, it's every old generation has issues with the new generation, and the generational stuff is not changed. Yes, there are generational differences, but just being a baby boomer, we were terrible. We had the same sort of conflicts. So yes, there are generational differences, and they're evergreen. And excuse me for using a crass example, but there's evidence that kind of every group of teenagers believe they discovered sex, and they really haven't. And I think that's this idea that when somebody faces something that's brand new, and for us older folks, it's for me as an older folk, there are younger people in this room, that, for me, I'm looking at like the new generation and saying, oh, those kids, and then I start thinking, oh, we were terrible. If anything, baby boomers, we were much less responsible than the younger Stanford students. And I was delivering pizzas on the Stanford campus. I knew what was going on in the dorms 40 years ago, and it was more horrible than it was now. So the generational stuff, yes, it exists, but no, there's nothing special about the new generation. There's a guy at Wharton, Peter Capelli, who does research on this. In his perspective, for example, when he compares millennials to other generations, is that they're very similar in what they want compared to other generations, but they're actually more focused on financial security and money than other generations because all their parents got laid off during the meltdown and then the 2002 meltdown. Anything else? Anything back to how we can make this better at Stanford, or was that just Betsy, yeah.
Well, one thing I just think of, because if we could empower people to make decisions and trust that they're managing their business, like the ones in charge, and that would alleviate them having to be in the meetings. To me, Betsy's getting at trust that, and it's the way Huggy puts this. Huggy has this notion that when people are really excited about doing something, they think you should just charge ahead and you can trust everyone. And when people are really worried, there's more and more mistrust. So if we could trust one another just a little bit more, it might actually help with the process. Yeah. So I gave a talk on scaling about 5 years ago to the people who do financial processing. I forgot, what is that group called in Stanford? What? Oh, I forgot who it was, but I said, please trust us. And they all kind of glared at me, I think. Okay, the next one, so we have 8 minutes and we will end on time. The next one is a little bit more subtle, but so one of the things that Huggy and I keep seeing in organization after organization, including Stanford, is what we call kind of perverse incentives. And so we call this the George Carlin problem. So the comedian George Carlin, so it's this notion that my shit is stuff. So the stuff I do, the friction I add to the system, the new program, that's my stuff and it's great. And your stuff is shit. And so one of the problems is perverse incentives are sometimes called the tragedy of the commons, that we seem, and not just Stanford, but many systems have a set of incentives where everybody has an incentive for adding stuff. It might be financial, it might be emotional, it might be one thing that seems to happen at Stanford, although I've had some pushback on this, but I still believe it. I do believe at Stanford that the more people report to you, the more you get paid on average. So that's something that I think that would add to sort of bureaucratic bloat. The example I use is about 5 years ago, we had a faculty meeting where two very excited people came to our faculty meeting and told us about the new customizable teaching system that was being added. And my main reaction to it was, well, if I do this, it will add 5 hours of work a year to what I do. And gee, by the way, there was no evidence that their new exciting customizable teaching system had any validity or reliability for assessing teaching evaluations, because teaching evaluations almost never do. But for those people who were adding it, they were just so excited about adding it, and it was great for them, but for the rest of us, it was sort of adding load. So that's one of the things that happens with a lot of corporate improvement programs too, that there's somebody who's really excited about it and gets credit, and then you got to go to the meetings and everything, and that's fabulous, but what makes them excited and rewards them if you sort of add it to the pool, it adds load for all of us. And in general, one of the things Huggy and I are always interested in is one of the things that adds friction is we have a bunch of incentive for adding things and a no or little incentive for removing it. I think that's, any comments about this? Because I think this is something that at Stanford we really could work on.
maybe change the incentives a little bit. Any comments or questions about this? Okay, 5 minutes. Yeah, yes.
I think what I'm seeing in your presentation is that these are really good observations, but what I would like to hear more is the strategies. So if you were in a situation of case 4, whatever the name of it, and there is a power hierarchy, what would you do to be able to affect change and make it easy on you? As a faculty member, it might have been easier for you to talk to the staff members
Right.
who came up with this strategy, but what if it was staff reporting to a supervisor was in the same situation?
Well, so that's one of the reasons that I wanted to have the camera shut off while we were talking. I'm serious, and for me, for starters, making it safe for people to complain to their boss when something isn't good or something is getting in the way or making things difficult. I won't speak for anybody here. I don't feel particularly safe doing that for the part of Stanford that I work in. Maybe other people do. So we could work on psychological safety. The other thing that we could do, and I don't know whether this will apply to specific staffs, but you might want to look at the behavior that you reward either in your boss or the people who you oversee or you support. Because a lot of times we have incentive for saying no to things and making things more difficult for others. And sometimes that's rational, and sometimes it's just because it makes us feel good. So, and I'll get to why it might make you feel good in a minute, not you, but people in general. But the best I can start out with is something like psychological safety, and also, one thing I like Betsy said, if our bosses trusted us a little bit more, maybe things wouldn't be so hard to do sometimes. And I know there's compliance, I know we don't want unlawful things to happen, I'm not advocating that. But in some ways, though, when we can answer that, we can write the book, and there's a reason we can't write the book yet, too. So that's the other thing. Okay, 3 minutes. I'm going to end on my last one. Okay, so we're not going to have time. So a final thing. So in general, I'm trying to avoid blaming people too much, except for senior leaders. Since I was like, they take those jobs that they deserve to be blamed. I'm sorry, they get paid a lot, and that's their job. But the other thing that has really fascinated me at Stanford and other places, and we'll end with this one, and at the end there's a bunch of stuff about positive friction when friction is good, so just keep that in mind. But there are certain people, and this has fascinated me at Stanford in particular, to see people in structurally nearly equivalent positions, and some people, when you go to them, they will follow the rules, but they will make things easy. And some people, when you go to them, they will make things hard. So we talk about grease people and gunk people. And so just an example, somebody in my department who's a real person, Lori Cottle. I consider Lori Cottle, who's our head of student services. She's been here 25 years, been here a long time. Lori is very good at following the rules, but she's also very good at trying to figure out how to make things easy as possible for students and for faculty. And there are other people who have the exact opposite effects. And those other people, sometimes they're called rule Nazis. And these are people who really cling to the rules and insist you follow them. And there's a twist here. And so I've got 2 minutes, I'm not even going to show the thing. There's some really interesting research that to me has explained at least the people I know who are rule Nazis in addition to maybe their enduring personality characteristics. But this is something you can create reliably in the lab over and over again, which is that if you put somebody in a position where they have a lot of influence over others, but they don't feel respected, they don't feel like they have any prestige, think of the people who work at the DMV, what will happen is they will reliably take it out on other people to feel better about themselves and to take control over the world. So yes, it might be that these gunk people who are so part of the problem might be the structural position, but some of it is if you have somebody in your life who is a gunk person who makes things difficult, showing them some respect and some appreciation, that's not my natural reaction. And Betsy knows this, she's sitting here, she works with me. My natural reaction when somebody at Stanford makes things difficult for me, but if you look at the research on petty tyrants is what the label tends to be, you can reliably create a petty tyrant by putting people in a high power, low respect position. So treating people like that with respect and expressing appreciation might get them to calm down a little bit. Okay, so we're at time. I'm happy to stay around and talk and answer questions or talk about whatever you want. The highlight, just just to sort of end with it, is this idea of being trustees of people's time. I wish I could have answered your question better. I want people to keep asking that question because that's to write our book and to be useful. We've actually got to do that sort of stuff. And then the final thing I want to emphasize is that there are a bunch of reasons for friction. When you're about to do something stupid, people are going to do something that's unlawful. In those situations, slowing down and making things harder to do actually makes sense. So I didn't have time to dig into that. So thank you so much for your time, and I appreciate your the Q&A especially. Thank you. All right. Thank you. All right.